Hello everyone, this is Professor Todd Giles. Continuing our video lectures for AR105 in week 2. We're looking at Roman art for this video. And let's take a look real quick at the hallmarks. What to look for when you're trying to place that piece of artwork into a certain an art period. Here, let's look at sculpture first. Divide up the sculpture into two groups, Republic or Empire. And there really is a difference. The Republic really wants to be realistic and individualized versus the Empire that is trying to idealize, still be realistic, but they were still trying to make it look like a real person and an individual, but to make them better looking than they really were. And then with their architecture, probably the biggest thing is their assimilation of the Etruscan and the Greek temples and buildings, and the huge size of many of their buildings. Right? So let's look at something here. But first, real quickly, talking about Romans as innovators. You might think the Romans were great innovators, as in coming up with their own new devices. You know, how could they have an empire that big and make buildings that huge unless they had great new technology? But they really didn't. What they did was take what other civilizations had before them and then make it better. They were great engineers. So concrete, they took what the Etruscans had as a recipe for concrete, added a certain type of sand to it, other chemicals into it, and they got better concrete. Concrete that could make buildings as huge as the Colosseum and the Pantheon. Absolutely huge and magnificent places. Arches, they improved on. Aqueducts, now they can bring water in from hundreds of miles away versus just a few miles away. Their sculptures, many of the sculptures that we will see here were created by Greek slaves that brought the knowledge of the Greek sculptures, the great Greek sculptures that we had seen in the first week. They brought all of that knowledge into Rome, and the Romans loved Greek art. So they took it, they improved on it, and the law and the military coming from others also. Now, here's an example very quickly of how they would assimilate. Here we see a small temple in Rome, the Temple of Portunus, and it assimilates features between the Etruscan and the Greek temples. They both have the same style of roof, a pediment here, that triangle, where it was more simplified, where it didn't have as much of the sculptural detail on it. Taking from the Etruscan, it's up on this base. Also from the Etruscan, staircase in the front, that's where you enter. You can't enter anywhere else. Where the Greeks had steps up on all four sides. The enclosed area of the room behind the front porch, that's Etruscan. So there are elements back and forth between these two societies, the Etruscan and the Greek. So the Romans, again, were bringing pieces in from around them and then molding new things from those ingredients. And just a real quick note here. Here's I believe it's a bank building in Rome that was built in the 1930s. However, what they did, they built on the site of an ancient temple. And this gives you an idea of how big that temple was in relationship to this car. So back during the Renaissance, this temple was used as a quarry. They would actually use the stone that was in the ancient Roman buildings and make new buildings out of them, usually the palaces or even St. Peter's Basilica on the other side of the Tiber River. But as you're in Rome today, you can walk by here and see this old temple built into this bank building. And you see this sort of duality. Now, again, what we see here is modern, only about 100 years old, if that, probably from the 1930s. Brief history, you can just look at that, you can get that elsewhere. So let's look at the artwork. Okay, let's look at the busts or the sculptures of the Republic and then leading into the Empire. This is just a typical sculptural bust or sculpture head and shoulders of an individual, a Roman patrician or someone who's in power, probably rich, and we see him as he really was. How old is he? He's probably old. He's not perfect. People walking down the street, if they were to see this piece standing on a wall outside of his home, they would recognize him. They would recognize his nose and how large it is. They would recognize the folds of his ears. They would recognize that he has an underbite and that maybe he doesn't have his front upper teeth. Okay? That he has bags underneath his eyes, that he's wrinkled. Okay? So it would be individualized. They would actually know him by this bust. And that's important to the Romans because they did have a little bit of ancestor worship. Not that they worshiped their ancestors as gods during that time, during the Republic, but the connection of their ancestors all the way back to the gods that created Rome. Okay, so here we see 3 generations of powerful men in Rome. We see the man who's alive today, or at that time, his father, and probably his grandfather. And people, and what I've been told is that this would have been standing in the entranceway to his home, to this man's home. So people who would come to him for favors would be able to see 3 generations of power. Okay? And they would recognize the facial features and the family resemblance. And it would actually give some, maybe some starstruckness or some awe or fear. So they are trying to look like that individual. Here's a piece, 2 different pieces of Julius Caesar. Okay, they're 2 different pieces, but they have similar details on them. The nose, the chin, the neck. Here a little bit, not as much the hair, although Caesar is famous for having a receding hairline. Okay, but having a little bit of an overbite. So we can see that maybe there was one piece of sculpture that looked really like him, and then after that, the artist would look at that one to create new ones. But it needed to look like the person. Then once we get into the empire with Augustus, we have this, where this is a piece of Augustus Caesar. This is a portrait of him, but how old is he here? He might look in his mid-20s, 30, and Augustus was much older than that. He was a military leader, but he, at that time when he became emperor, he was not a robust man. He didn't have muscular arms, muscular legs. So what's going on here? Okay. Do you recognize anything with this piece? Does it look like another piece that we've studied? Yeah, it's looking like these 2 pieces. The Doryphorus from ancient Greece, it really is one of the most perfect pieces, showing movement, showing the contrapposto pose, where he's turning his body, he's just moving that foot. And look here, that foot is just moving, that knee is back, that foot is flat. He's looking off a little bit at an angle. And then there's a combination here where they're taking the Etruscan with the hand up asking for silence. Okay, and we see a toga. So on this new statue, it's a new conglomeration of the old Greek and the more local Etruscan into something brand new. And what do we see him here doing? He's asking for peace with his hand up, or quiet. He's in the pose of ancient Greece, so that gives it some weight and some power behind it. He has this breastplate on showing 10 different victories that he won as a military leader. So he's a military leader. He has his toga, and that means that he's both a political leader and a religious leader. And then he has the scepter that reiterates that he's a political leader. And many places around the empire would have sculptures like this around to show the people what their emperors look like. The problem is they were idolized and it was propaganda. And these two sculptures I took photos of at the Louvre in Paris, and there are hundreds of these, maybe not hundreds, I'll say many dozens of this style of Roman emperors that were all over the empire, all across Europe, Northern Africa. And when they would get a new emperor, what would happen? Well, you're not going to have a whole new body made. So what would they do? They would lop off the head, and then they would have new sculptures created of just the head. And that would be put onto the body. And we can see this one of Trajan, that you can sort of see a little bit there, and his head is way too small for the body. So it looks a little bit strange, okay? So whoever made this head didn't know what the body size was and sort of guesstimated, and it didn't turn out very well. Now through time, underneath the emperors where they're trying to look idolized. Here's one of Nero, who you can look up how bad Nero was. Here's a portrait of him with barely any detail. Maybe a little bit of detail on his hair and the width of his face, and maybe a little bit on his mouth, but not a lot of detail. Vitellius here only ruled for less than a year and was a horrible emperor, but he was grossly overweight, and guess what? That is how they made him look. They didn't really idolize him very well, okay? And we can see him in many of his portraits like this. But the others, they might have been a little bit overweight, but they made them look like they were still strong. Even if they were old, weak, whatever. They still wanted a little bit like him, but still idolized. Now, one that sort of cracks me up is this portrait, or two portraits of Caracalla, one of the worst emperors. You can look up the history if you want, but it really shows his meanness, his low brow. He's scowling at everything, and this is your emperor. Instead of being a nice guy that everyone can relate to because he cares about everyone, no, it's not like that. He really is out for his own power and to take as much as he can. And then during the first century, we see images like this of the women. It wasn't just the emperors who had their portrait busts done, but there were powerful women too. And even some of the more beautiful women would have their portrait done in stone. And I'm glad because now we're able to see documentation of their hairstyles. This probably was not her own hair, it's probably a wig, but it's a very beautiful type of style that is absolutely mind-boggling. But we also have something like this. An older woman with what does definitely look like something that she just plopped down on top of her head with curls and curls and curls. All right? And in the next video, we'll go on talking about the architecture.